The twin screams of Min-jae and Min-seo tore through the pressurized air of the first-class cabin, a jagged, rhythmic sound that no amount of luxury could dampen. Across the aisle, high-ranking associates and flight attendants held their breath, their faces pale, staring fixedly at their hands or the floor. No one dared to offer a look of irritation. Not when the man in seat 1A looked like he was about to set the sky on fire. Kim Won-sik sat with a terrifying, rigid stillness, his slicked-back dark hair perfect, yet his prominent jawline pulsed with a tension that threatened to snap. His tailored suit jacket felt less like a garment of power and more like a straitjacket. Beneath his crisp white collar, the dark ink of his neck tattoos seemed to crawl with every shallow breath he took. His hands, heavy with gold rings that symbolized his dominance over half of Asia's ports, gripped the armrests so hard the leather groaned. For the first time in his life, the Dragon of Soul was facing an enemy he couldn't bribe, threaten, or break. His cold, suspicious eyes, usually narrowed in calculation, were wide with a rare, shattering emotion, pure, helpless desperation. The twins, the only living legacy of the woman he had lost, flailed against the silence of the cabin, their cries signaling a hunger that bottles couldn't satisfy. Won-sik felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple, a sensation more terrifying than any standoff he'd faced in the back alleys of Gangnam. He looked down at Min-jae, whose face was a worrying shade of purple, and then at Min-seo, whose tiny hands were clawing at the air. 3 rows ahead, Clara Craig felt the sound in her very marrow. It wasn't just noise to her. It was a frequency she was tuned to. For months, she had lived in a world of suffocating silence, the ghost of a nursery that was no longer occupied. Now, the primal burst of need from those infants triggered something biological she couldn't suppress. Her breasts ached with a sudden, sharp letdown, a physical ghost of the motherhood that had been ripped away from her. Ignoring the warning look from a stone-faced bodyguard, Clara unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The cabin went deathly quiet. She walked forward, her movements steady despite her pounding heart. Won-sik's head snapped up, his eyes sharp as glass, assessing her for a weapon. "They're starving," Clara said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "And they won't take the bottle because they're looking for the heartbeat. They're looking for her." Won-sik's jaw tightened at the mention of his late wife. "Who are you?" he rasped. "Someone who can help," she replied. She reached out, her hands certain and warm. For a second, Won-sik's instinct was to recoil, to protect his heirs from the touch of a stranger. But then Min-jae let out a choked, exhausted sob that broke the last of his pride. He allowed her to take the boy, and as the infant touched her chest, the screams softened into ragged gasps. Won-sik sat back, his hands finally dropping to his lap, unaware that he had just surrendered the keys to his empire to the woman who saved his sons. The heavy velvet curtain of the galley hissed shut, sealing Clara and the twins into a world of dim light and silver service shadows. Behind her, the silence in the first-class cabin was deafening, a vacuum left behind by the sudden absence of the infant's distress. Clara sat on the narrow jump seat, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked down at the tiny, frantic life in her arms. Min-jae was still gasping, his face blotchy, his small mouth searching with a desperation that only a mother, or a woman who had lost everything, could truly understand. She didn't hesitate. With practiced, gentle movements, she shifted her blazer and guided the infant to her breast. The moment he latched, the cabin seemed to fall away. The roar of the jet engines faded into a distant hum, replaced by the rhythmic, wet sounds of a child finding life again. A profound, familiar warmth bloomed in Clara's chest, a physical and emotional tether that she hadn't felt since the funeral. This wasn't just a nurse performing a duty, this was a soul pouring itself into another. Suddenly, the curtain twitched. Clara tensed, pulling her wrap closer, but it was only one Schick. He didn't enter fully, he stood in the threshold, his massive frame blocking out the light from the cabin. His expression was no longer one of a predator, but of a man witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. He watched the way Minjae's tiny hand curled instinctively around Clara's finger, his grip tightening as he drank his fill. One Schick's eyes moved from his son to Clara's face. In the flickering light of the galley, the racial and social barriers between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by something ancient and undeniable. In his culture, this was more than a favor. It was the creation of a bloodkin bond. By giving his heirs her own life force, she had effectively claimed them, and he had claimed her. My wife. Isabella, she could not, he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. It was a confession of his own powerlessness. Clara looked up, her gaze steady despite the tears pricking her eyes. He's safe now. They both will be. She reached out her free arm, beckoning for Mincio, who was still whimpering in the bassinet beside the dawn. As one Schick handed over the second twin, his fingers brushed against Clara's skin. A jolt of pure, electric intensity passed between them, a spark of protection, possession, and a strange, budding hope. As the second twin began to feed, a heavy, sacred stillness settled over the trio. Clara knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she would never walk off this plane and back into her old life. She had nourished the dragon's blood, and now, the dragon would never let her go. The wheels of the Gulfstream kissed the tarmac of Incheon International Airport with a definitive thud, signaling the end of the flight but the beginning of a reality Clara could barely comprehend. As the engines began their low, whining descent into silence, the cabin door creaked open, admitting a rush of humid, morning air and a phalanx of men in identical dark suits. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace, lining the mobile staircase like a wall of stone. One Schick stood first, his presence expanding to fill the cabin once more. The vulnerability he had shown in the galley was gone, tucked away behind a mask of cold, imperious glass. He didn't ask Clara to follow, he simply looked at her, then at the twins now sleeping soundly in their travel bassinets. They must not be disturbed, he said, his voice a low vibration of command. And you must not be separated from them. Clara clutched her carry-on bag, her knuckles white. She was ushered off the plane not toward the bustling main terminal, but into a waiting convoy of 3 black, armored SUVs idling on the private apron. The transition was seamless, a blur of motion where her feet barely seemed to touch the ground before she was tucked into the plush, leather interior of the center vehicle. As the convoy sped away from the airport, the skyline of Seoul rose in the distance, a glittering forest of steel and neon. But they didn't head for the city center. Instead, the cars began an ascent into the winding, wooded roads of the Bukhansan Mountains. They stopped before a massive perimeter wall topped with discreet security cameras and iron gates that slid open only after a retinal scan of the lead driver. The estate was a fortress of glass and traditional eaves, a golden cage that looked out over the world it dominated. When the car door opened, Clara stepped out into a courtyard of silent stone and manicured gardens. A line of staff stood bowed in perfect unison. "Welcome home, master," a woman in a sharp hanbok murmured. Clara turned to one Schick, her breath catching in the thin mountain air. "I was supposed to go to my hotel, Mr. Kim." I have an interview tomorrow. One chick stopped and turned to her. The sunlight caught the gold rings on his hand as he gestured toward the vast, looming house. The world outside these walls is no longer safe for you, Clara. You have fed the heirs of the Kim family. In the eyes of my enemies, you are now the heart of this house. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, possessive and absolute. You are no longer a traveler. You are a guest of the dragon. And the dragon does not let his treasures leave. The nursery within the mountain fortress was a sanctuary of pale silk and polished mahogany, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the exterior. Clara sat in a low, hand-carved nursing chair, the twins finally resting in their twin bassinets. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant, haunting call of a mountain bird. When the heavy door creaked open, one chick entered, having traded his suit jacket for a traditional black silk robe that flowed around him like smoke. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the misty valleys of Seoul. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of the unspoken. In my world, Clara, everything is transactional, one chick began, his voice barely a whisper against the glass. Power is bought with blood. Loyalty is enforced with fear. But there are laws older than the syndicate. Laws that even the dragon must bow to. He turned to face her, the light from the nursery lamp catching the sharp angles of his face. The blood can bond. By offering your milk to Min Jae and Min Seo, you have performed a sacred infusion. You are no longer a stranger who helped a desperate man. You are the Goryeo mother. In the eyes of my tradition, the fluid that sustained them has made you their parent in every way that matters. Clara stood up, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. I was just being human, one chick. I'm not looking for a title or a bond. I just want to go back to my life. There is no back, one chick said, stepping into her space. He reached out, his gold rings cold against her skin as he gently tilted her chin up. Because you are now sacred to me, you are a blasphemy to my enemies. To the Yakuza and the rival clans, you are the ultimate weapon. If they kill a bodyguard, they wound my pride. If they touch you, they destroy the very source of my heir's life. Clara's breath hitched as the gravity of his words settled in. She looked at the sleeping twins, so innocent, so fragile. And then back at the man who was both her protector and her captor. You have become the heart of this house, he continued, his thumb brushing her jawline with a possessiveness that made her shiver. And in the underworld, the heart is always the first thing the enemy tries to cut out. You stay because I cannot let you die. You stay because you are now part of the dragon's horde. And the dragon will burn the world to ash before he lets anyone lay a finger on what is his. The transition from traveler to a member of the dragon's inner sanctum was marked by the weight of silk and the sharp scent of cedar. To the outside world, Clara Craig had vanished. Within the mountain fortress, she was given a new identity. A tailored maid's uniform lay across her bed, a crisp black dress with a white silk apron, designed with a discreet nursing slit that spoke of one chick's meticulous, possessive attention to detail. Putting on the uniform felt like a surrender, but as Clara looked into the nursery mirror, she saw a woman who no longer looked hollowed out by grief. The twins, Min Jae and Min Seo, were thriving. Their once sunken cheeks were now full and rosy, their cries replaced by soft, contented gurgles. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, as she cradled both infants at once, Clara felt a strange, forbidden peace. The milk she gave them seemed to wash away the gray film of her own mourning, the twins filling the void her daughter had left behind. One-Chick began to appear more frequently, not as a commander, but as a shadow at the edge of her light. He would stand in the doorway, his tie loosened, watching the domestic tableau with an intensity that made Clara's skin tingle. One evening, as the rain lashed against the panoramic windows, he approached her while she was burping Mincio. "You look natural with them," he murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he brushed a stray lock of hair away from Clara's forehead. His touch was no longer just the claim of a master, it was the tentative reach of a lonely man. "They saved me as much as I saved them," Clara replied, looking up at him. She saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, the heavy price of the crown he wore. For a moment, the icy mask he presented to the world cracked. He didn't pull away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the nursing chair, his shoulder brushing hers. He watched his daughter's tiny fingers wrap around his thumb, a thumb that had pulled triggers and signed death warrants, and his expression softened into something resembling wonder. "I thought I was bringing you here to save my legacy," One-Chick admitted, his gaze drifting from the child to Clara's lips. "But I think you are bringing life back into a house that has been dead for a very long time." The air between them grew heavy, charged with a new kind of tension that had nothing to do with the Mafia and everything to do with the two broken people finding a strange, shared heartbeat in the center of a storm. Clara didn't move away. For the first time, the golden cage didn't feel like a prison, it felt like a home she was terrified to lose. The fragile piece of the mountain fortress was shattered not by a sound, but by a digital ghost. In the dimly lit security hub of the estate, a monitor flickered with a grainy, long-range photograph taken from a drone miles away. It captured Clara on the balcony, the sunlight catching her dark skin as she rocked Min-jae, her head bowed in a moment of quiet maternal prayer. Miles away, in a rain-slicked boardroom overlooking the Tokyo skyline, the image was projected onto a wall for the leaders of the Yamaguchi-Victorio alliance. For years, they had searched for a fracture in Kim One-Chick's armor. They had tried to seize his ports, bribe his captains, and ambush his convoys, but the dragon had remained impenetrable. Now, they saw it, a nurse in a maid's uniform who held the future of the Kim dynasty in her hands. "The dragon has grown a heart," the elder Sato murmured, his voice like dry parchment. "And a heart can be stopped." Back at the compound, the air grew heavy with a premonition of violence. One-Chick was no longer the man who sat quietly in the nursery, he was a storm cloud brewing. He spent his nights in the war room, his eyes bloodshot, watching the thermal feeds of the perimeter. He knew the chatter in the underworld had changed. The price on his head had been doubled, but the price for Clara Craig was now astronomical. She was no longer just a nurse, she was the sacred key to breaking him. One evening, a message arrived, not a letter, but a package left at the outer gate. Inside was a single, charred black feather and a photograph of the twins' nursery window with a red crosshair superimposed over the glass. One-Chick burst into the nursery, his breathing ragged. Clara looked up, startled, as he moved with a sudden, desperate violence to pull the heavy blackout curtains shut. "What happened?" she whispered, clutching Mincio to her chest. One-Chick didn't answer immediately. He stood in the center of the room, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had brought light into his tomb, and felt a terrifying, clawing fear. "The East has seen you, Clara," he finally said, his voice trembling with a lethal edge. "They know you are the reason my sons still breathe. They think that by taking you, they can make me kneel." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek with a tenderness that felt like a goodbye. "They are coming. And when they do, I will have to show them why I am called the dragon. But I fear that in the fire, I might lose the very thing I am trying to save." Clara saw the truth in his eyes. The war had found them, and the mountain was no longer a sanctuary, but a target. The sky over the Bukansan Mountains didn't break with thunder. It broke with the concussive thump of a perimeter breach. The lights in the nursery flickered once, then died, plunging the room into a terrifying, velvet darkness. Before Clara could scream, one chick was there, his shadow moving with the lethal fluidity of a ghost. "The safe room. Now," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the sudden wail of the security sirens. Clara scooped Minjae and Mincio into her arms, her maternal instinct overriding the paralyzing fear. As they moved toward the hidden door behind the mahogany bookshelf, the sounds of the night changed. The rhythmic pop-pop of suppressed gunfire echoed through the marble hallways below. The dragon's fortress was being flayed open. One chick shoved them into the reinforced steel vault, but he didn't follow. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the red emergency strobes pulsing in the hallway. He had a handgun in each hand, his knuckles white, his expression an ancient mask of rage. "One chick, come inside," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking as she huddled on the floor with the infants. "I am the shield, Clara," he rasped, looking back at her for one agonizing second. "If I enter this room, I am leading them to the prize. I stay until the hall is silent." Suddenly, a hail of bullets chewed into the doorframe. One chick grunted, his body jerking as a round caught him in the shoulder, crimson blooming instantly across his white shirt. He didn't fall. He stepped into the line of fire, his own weapons barking back with a deafening, rhythmic fury. He was a dying god protecting his temple. With a bloody hand, he slammed the manual override, and the 10-ton steel door hissed shut, sealing Clara and the twins in a tomb of silence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and Clara's own frantic breath. She could no longer hear the battle, only the terrifying thrum of her own heart and the soft, confused whimpers of the twins. She sat on the cold floor, her back against the reinforced wall, pulling the babies to her chest. She began to hum, a low, trembling melody she had sung to her own lost child, trying to drown out the thought of one chick bleeding out on the other side of that door. Hours seemed to pass in the oxygen-rich silence. Clara watched the internal security monitors, but the feeds were static. She was the mother of the heirs, the heart of the house, and now, she was the only thing standing between the Kim legacy and the void. She looked down at the twins, their dark eyes reflecting her own terror, and realized that if one chick didn't return, she wouldn't just be their nurse, she would be their only hope for survival in a world that wanted them dead. The silence of the safe room was eventually broken not by an explosion, but by the mechanical hum of the door's release. When the heavy steel slid back, it revealed a scene of carnage, but in the center of the hallway stood one chick. He was pale, his left arm bound in a makeshift sling of blood-soaked silk, his face gaunt from loss of blood. He didn't say a word as he looked at Clara and the twins. He simply leaned his forehead against the doorframe, his chest heaving with a jagged, spent relief. He had survived the night, but he knew the war was only beginning. The breach had proven that no mountain was high enough to hide a man with his sins. 3 days later, one chick traveled to the Chamber of 5 Dragons, a hidden traditional tea house in the heart of Old Seoul where the Council of Elders convened. These were the men who held the true strings of the syndicate, ancient figures who valued order above all else. One chick entered the room alone, refusing his guards. He moved with a slight limp, the scent of antiseptic clinging to his dark suit. The elders sat in a semicircle, their faces like masks of carved bone. "You have brought a foreign element into our lineage," one chick, the eldest, Chairman Han, spoke. "The Goryeo mother has made you weak. Your enemies see a target where there should be a throne." One chick didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and placed his gold dragon seal, the symbol of his absolute authority, on the low wooden table. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I am not here to defend my throne," one chick said, his voice raspy but unshakable. "I am here to abdicate it. I am handing over the ports, the transit lines, and the loyalty of my captains to my successor, Jin Ho." A ripple of shock passed through the elders. To walk away from such power was unheard of. In exchange, one chick continued, leaning forward, his eyes burning with a lethal intensity, "I demand eternal sanctuary for Clara Craig and my sons. You will sign the edicts of peace. You will declare them ghostkin, untouchable by any syndicate, under penalty of total annihilation by the council. I give you my empire, you give them the world." The elders whispered among themselves. They looked at the seal, a fortune beyond imagining, and then at the man who was willing to throw it away for a woman and 2 infants. "You would become a nobody for them?" Chairman Han asked, incredulous. "I would become a father," one chick replied. After a grueling hour of negotiation, the brush hit the parchment. The edicts were signed. One chick walked out of the tea house, leaving behind the weight of the crown. He stepped into the cool Seoul rain, his pockets empty of power but his heart, for the first time, full of a freedom that felt like a sunrise. He was no longer a king, but he was finally going home to the only people who knew his real name. The heavy gates of the mountain fortress creaked open one last time, not to admit a convoy of armored SUVs, but to let a single, unpretentious sedan pass through. Behind the wheel, one chick wore a simple linen shirt, the gold rings and the weight of the dragon seal gone from his hands. Beside him, Clara held a sleeping Min Seo, while Min Jae slumbered in the back, the cabin filled with the soft, peaceful breathing of children who no longer knew the sound of gunfire. They settled in a coastal village far from the neon pulse of Seoul, where the air tasted of salt and the only hierarchy was determined by the tides. Their new home was a modest house with wide windows that drank in the morning sun. Here, Kim Won-shik was simply a man who spent his mornings learning how to assemble cribs and his afternoons walking the shoreline with 2 infants strapped to his chest. The lethal tension that had once defined his every movement had been replaced by a grounded, quiet strength. One evening, as the orange glow of the sunset dipped below the horizon, Clara stood on the porch, watching one chick gently rock a fussy Min Jae. The Goryeo mother and the retired Dawn were no longer bound by ancient underworld codes or survival instincts. The uniform was gone, replaced by a soft sundress. The safe room was a memory, replaced by a garden of blooming jasmine. One chick looked up as Clara approached, his expression softening into a smile that reached his eyes. A look that would have been unrecognizable to his former associates. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering with a tenderness that was no longer a claim of possession, but a promise of partnership. "Is it quiet enough for you?" he whispered, his voice clear and free of the rasp of command. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the vast, calm sea. "It's perfect. No more shadows, one chick." "No more shadows," he agreed. In this quiet corner of the world, they were no longer a nurse fleeing grief or a mobster fleeing a throne. They were a father and a mother, bound by a bond of milk and sacrifice that had proven stronger than any empire. As they walked back into the warmth of their home, leaving the door unlocked for the first time in their lives, they knew the war was over. In the House of the Dragon, love had finally become the only law, and for the first time, the family was truly whole.